Good morning, everybody. Welcome to IntoUniversity's conference, and thank you very much for coming. My name is Rachel Carr, and I'm the Chief Executive and co-founder of IntoUniversity. I want to start by explaining why we think place-based working is such an important issue to be discussing. We're interested, among other things, in the relationships between places, educational outcomes, socioeconomic positions, health conditions, and long-term employment prospects. Essentially, how geography and equality are closely interrelated, which means that in Britain, where you live shapes your fortunes. While certainly not new, the extent of this geographical power was perhaps illuminated in one way by the Brexit referendum and the subsequent general elections in 2017 and 2019, which showed that there are different Britons in which people have very different ways of seeing the world. Without wanting to undermine the nuances and range of experiences within these areas, these votes reveal correlations between places with higher proportions of Leave voters and higher proportions of poverty, unemployment, and lack of access to further education. This suggests that the opportunities available to people in a specific place also play a role in shaping their way of seeing the world. This geographical power has been further illuminated in a rather different way, I think, by the current COVID-19 crisis. Some of the narrative at the beginning of the pandemic focused on the virus as an equalizer. We're all in this together, wherever we live, whatever our place, whatever our background. But of course, from the start, we have never all been equally susceptible to the consequences of the virus, whether that be the economic ramifications, the educational scarring caused by lost learning, or indeed the chances of catching it. As we now know, for example, those from BAME communities are much more likely to die from COVID-19. According to the Office for National Statistics, although further research is needed, this is a consequence of pre-existing inequalities in wealth, health, education, and crucial factors such as housing. So place matters. And it could be argued that solutions must also consider the lens of place and place-based work. One example of this is the government's opportunity areas, a social mobility scheme introduced by the Department of Education in 2016, providing targeted funding to 12 areas across the UK to boost educational opportunities for young people. These opportunity areas are certainly focused on specific places in need, but in order to work effectively, they of course must have local on-the-ground engagement and partnerships and long-term impact measurement. I'm thinking here of a successful place-based initiative such as the Born in Bradford programme. These questions of partnership and timeframes are central to effective place-based working that can make tangible changes to young people's lives and futures. They are also at the heart of IntoUniversity's centre-based approach, in which each of our 31 centres and extension projects are embedded in a specific local community, built through partnerships with schools, families and universities within their surrounding area. Our first centre was set up in the shadow of the now infamous Grenfell Tower, very specifically to support the communities living on that local council estate. And as we've opened new centres across England, we have continued this hyper-local community-based approach. In our view, time frame is also a key element of place-based working. Building the relationships that place-based work requires cannot be done overnight, and the most effective solutions must be sustainable in the long term to break the cycles of intergenerational exclusion. This is why our programmes begin working with primary school students as young as 7 years old to help raise their aspirations and offer support throughout their whole time in education. Discussing place-based work may seem strange at the current moment, when we are all largely operating remotely and perhaps feeling disconnected from specific places. But at IntoUniversity, the place-based nature of our work, the long-term positive relationships with local schools, partners and universities is precisely what has enabled us to continue our work throughout this time. Our delivery team have been offering pastoral and academic support to our students over the phone and online, and in some cases have been the only point of contact for parents homeschooling their children. Although we have embraced new methods to continue supporting our students, the current situation is highlighting the undeniable difficulties faced by young people from the UK's most disadvantaged areas. The Trussell Trust Food Banks reported an 89% increase in need in April 2020 compared to the same period last year, with a staggering 107% increase in emergency food parcels for children. The prospect of an economic recession is only going to push more families and young people into poverty, making it harder for them to access the education and work opportunities available to their peers in better off areas. So it is for all these reasons and more that we wanted to discuss place-based working today. And we're really excited for the conversations and debate that will take place this morning. The first of our two panel discussions will focus on the relationships between universities and communities, the role of place-based work, and the idea of the Civic University. The second panel will be discussing place-based work more broadly, considering what makes it effective, the perspectives of a funder, and how it can play a role in tackling educational disadvantage specifically. Before I hand over to Solomon, there are a few practical points. First, there will be a 10-minute welcome break, I'm sure, between the first and second panels to allow everyone to grab a cup of tea and look away from your screens. Second, you should be able to see a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can use that to ask questions of any of our panel speakers, and the panel chairs will pass your questions on to the speakers. You can also tweet about the conference using the hashtag #BeingThere, Place-Based Conference, IU Conference 2020. And finally, this is our first virtual conference, and we're very much hoping everything will run smoothly, but please do bear with us if there are any technical issues along the way. So I'm delighted today that we're going to be joined by two of our student advisory panel members, and I'm going to introduce the first of those to introduce our keynote speaker, and that's Solomon Pervez, who's just finishing his studies at University College London. He's planning on continuing his studies there next year. Solomon will introduce our keynote speaker and run the subsequent Q&A session from the pre-submitted questions we requested from you and any further questions. So Solomon, I'm really hoping that I'm passing over to you now to carry us forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for that really good sort of introduction that highlights the important work of IU in this time. So yeah, my name's Solomon Pervez. I'm a final year biochemistry undergraduate at UCL. And as Rachel mentioned, I'm a member of IntoUniversity Student Advisory Panel. And yeah, we're so excited and grateful to have Emma Hardy, the Shadow Minister for Further Education and Universities. And you know, we hope that the keynote is food for thought for all of us this Tuesday afternoon on this really important topic. So a bit about myself briefly. I joined the SAP last January, at the time it was set up. And the aim of the SAP is really to allow IntoUniversity students who've gained from the charity's work the chance to inform and offer opinions on the direction of IntoUniversity to ensure that the 30,000 strong student voice has its voice heard in decision making. And I've been involved with IntoUniversity coming up to 4 years now, since year 12, and I can't overstate how big of an influence the charity has been in my educational life. So coming from a first-generation family of immigrants who arrived in the UK with ambitious parents but who were unfamiliar with the workings of British society, I needed the experience support of IU to help me build my confidence, for me to then take that big step of being the first in my family to attend university. And indeed, from first helping me with my university personal statements to interview prep, I managed to secure an offer at UCL, and 3 years on, I'm now graduating with my bachelor's degree. But further to that, the insight into new industries that IU has given me has been absolutely invaluable through programs such as Big City Bright Future, where I secured an internship at BlackRock and was later paired with a corporate mentor from that firm. I was introduced to careers I'd never known about before, and you know, also engaged in other programs such as the Academy of Enterprise Scheme, which was a startup program in the summer of my first year at uni that built my business acumen. So early on, I could see the genuine, passionate support that the staff at IU gave me, and my phone was always ringing from the North Kent Centre about new opportunities I could get involved with. And you know, IU's given me so much, and I've been keen to give back. I joined the academic mentoring program a year and a half ago. Since then, I've been having bi-weekly meetings with a lovely young boy from a similar background, and I've loved seeing him develop and grow in confidence over the last few months, and I'm hoping to continue our sessions virtually from next week in this time. So clearly, the place-based working model to tackle educational disadvantage has massively benefited me. It's an exciting time to be working at the forefront all these challenges we still face. And it's so important to continue hosting events such as these to find how we can optimize value in creating those long-term relationships and localized needs. I'm sure this will be a fantastic session. And so thank you very much all who've attended to make this mission possible. And so now I'm delighted to introduce you to our keynote speaker, Emma Hardy. Emma was born and brought up in East Riding, just a few miles from the seat of Hessel and West Holt that she now represents in Parliament. She spent over 10 years teaching at a local primary school until in 2015, she became a full-time organizer for the National Union of Teachers and served as Deputy General Secretary of the Socialist Educational Association. She was elected to Parliament about 3 years ago in 2017, re-elected in 2019 and became Shadow Minister for Further Education and Universities earlier this year. During her time on the House of Commons Education Select Committee from 2017 to 19, Emma has challenged the government to ban informal exclusions, promoted the benefits of a curriculum that includes the arts, music, sports, and worked with the women's charity Endometriosis UK to successfully campaign for menstrual well-being to be included as part of sex and relationship education in schools. Emma has also lobbied successfully for the government to fund a new children and adolescent mental health unit in her constituency in Hull, which was completed in January 2020. And teaching and education, as we'll learn over the next 20 minutes, I'm sure, will have always been at the forefront of Emma's agenda, and she's constantly fighting to ensure that all of our young people's educational needs are provided for. So we've got a great speaker, and we're really excited to have you here. So over to you, Emma.
Morning, everyone. Thanks for that introduction. You'd almost think I'd written it myself. Delighted to be here and invited to speak to you all. And to be honest, I accepted the invitation partly because IntoUniversity is opening a new centre in my constituency. And I am as keen to learn about the organisation and the wider sector as much as I feel I have any kind of expert opinion or advice to dispense when I'm surrounded by a room full of experts. I mean, obviously I have personal views and I have convictions on the purpose of education and its role it can play in addressing social disadvantage and creating a more equal society. And from what I've heard here already, I believe those opinions, I hope, are quite similar to everybody else. I understand that IntoUniversity have all had to close all their centres and now offering support online and by telephone. And I completely understand the pandemic has thrown everything into turmoil. And in the context of widening participation, I am very worried that this will have a profound repercussion, not just for those who we are trying to encourage into university through schemes like this, but for those who have already been helped to get there. Because as you know, the financial situation for universities is grim. I am extremely alarmed by the report commissioned by the UCU from one of Europe's leading specialist economic consultants, London Economics, which forecasts a loss of 2.5 billion to universities through the widely predicted fall in student numbers in September. It confirms what I've been hearing from representative bodies and individual vice chancellors. I don't believe these figures are unrealistic. It doesn't take into account the loss of other income from things like accommodation or conferencing, and it is based on a relatively optimistic view of an economic recovery. It is also backed up by analysis from the Office of Budget Responsibility, which identified higher education as a sector most likely to take the hardest hit from the crisis. And it is vital that no higher education institution should be allowed to fall. The disappearance of individual institutions will have a disproportionate effect on the organisations like yourselves who are seeking to encourage and support people from disadvantaged backgrounds into higher education. It risks creating higher education cold spots in the country, regions where there is no access to higher education institute. And this impacts widening participation in two main ways. First, most higher education institutes engage in outreach activities in their local schools and local communities, delivering a wide range of activities, both on campus and in schools and colleges for all age groups. And I certainly see this with the work the university upholds. This is vital in raising awareness of higher education and to cultivate the self-belief in individuals. So often a barrier that this is something they can actually do and where they belong. Without these interventions, universities will remain distant, not just literally, but mentally and emotionally too. Second, we know that commuter students who do not live on campus but remain in their homes, either with their parents or in those they were living in before attending, are predominantly composed of the most underprivileged groups in society. They are the part-time students, students from low-income backgrounds, BAME, parents, carers, mature students. The vast majority of them simply would not be in higher education without it being locally available. The government's response has been to bring forward the payment of tuition fees to university, which provides no extra money, but simply makes more money available upfront. That won't address the fall of revenue from the fall in numbers. For that, universities are expected to use the coronavirus business interruption loan scheme. And beyond that, the government are creating a structured transformation scheme, which will deal with universities only on a case-by-case basis once the university has found itself in difficulties and had to approach the DfE for help. The details for this are a work in progress, and we are awaiting further information, but we have been told it should be viewed as a last resort. The government are also seem to see mergers and acquisitions as the way to keep all institutions afloat, but have been unwilling to elaborate when questioned on it. The OFS, when I spoke to them, seemed very aware of the role some universities play as anchor institutions in their communities and the damage that would be caused if any of them should fail, which I did find somewhat reassuring. Students' own finances are an area that is going to hit the most underprivileged because it also affects access and opportunities, not just the nitty-gritty of meeting daily living expenses. Students from low-income backgrounds will have been supporting their studies with work, as well as, more obviously, part-time students. These jobs are most likely to have been 0 hours or casual contacts that will not give access to a furlough scheme, nor can a full-time student claim universal credit as they are not actively seeking work. I have raised this issue on several occasions with Michelle Donnellan, the university's minister. There has been a lot of support for the establishment of a student hardship fund, which will provide universities with funding to allocate to students in need, probably on the basis of eligibility for a maintenance loan. However, the minister is content that universities' hardship funds are already adequate for the purpose of supporting those students who find themselves in difficulties. I am less than happy with the situation, as each university has different funding streams with their own criteria for eligibility, methods of applying, and things they will and won't pay for. I think some unanimity and minimum standards across the sector would be helpful if hardship funds are going to be the only financial resource students have to fall back on emergencies like this one. The most recent dropout rate figures have shown an increase, and I feel the likelihood is that underprivileged students will be overly represented in that increase. No doubt the dropout rate would be increased by the extra financial struggles brought on by the crisis, but also, of course, the upheaval, the stress, the uncertainty will have put an intolerable burden on those students who had existing mental health problems. I've raised this issue with Michelle Donnellan personally, and she does seem to view it as a serious problem, not just for students with pre-existing conditions, but as a wider mental health issue for all students. But having said that, the official response to any government intervention or additional support was to say, quote, "Many providers are bolstering their existing mental health services and adapting the delivery of these services to means other than face-to-face. These services are likely to be an important source of support to students during this period of isolation," end quote. Which is basically the consistent line emerging from government that whatever the issue is, the ball is in the university's court. As higher education has very quickly moved to the provision of online content, it has shone a bright light on the issue of digital poverty, while at the same time increasing the disadvantage for all those on the wrong side of it. I think there is an assumption that all young people, which of course are the only types of people who attend university, are plugged into the internet 24/7 and have all the latest devices. But this is very far from the case. A smartphone with a data cap is not a laptop or a PC with an unlimited data allowance. Many will have access through free Wi-Fi in their accommodation. Now they are at home. We know perfectly well that many of the homes of those IntoUniversity and others are supporting will not be afforded the same facilities and ease of working that others have. I've been campaigning on this issue locally and looking at providing laptops for primary age children in my area. And I'm sure you're all aware that the government scheme to provide them to primary age pupils has resulted, I think, so far, and please correct me if I'm wrong, in not one laptop actually having reached a primary age pupil yet, though I'm told they should be expecting them imminently. But I'm also supporting proposals for something which is called a zero rated list, which is an idea which has been supported by representatives of JISC, the AOC, UUK, and many other, which basically creates a list of websites which are data free, so that when students access these websites, they don't have to use any of their data allowance. I was again very disappointed by the response from government and the response from Ofcom about this, who seem to be putting it into the too difficult pile. But I think we should pursue this as an issue, because it'd be one way to help students from any kind of background save a bit of money in terms of accessing the materials that they need online. But what about the efforts to widen opportunities for next year? There are real worries from some quarters that we are in danger of overlooking an entire cohort. Sixth forms and colleges are closed. I know they are doing their very best to support students, but it is exactly the students we are concerned with today who will suffer the most from missing the support and encouragement that comes from the personal relationships they have with peers and teachers, and the confidence gained from being part of a group all headed in the same direction. Applying is a complicated and daunting prospect for many 18-year-olds. If they are from a home where they would be the first in the family to go to university, it puts them at an obvious disadvantage for those whose parents who've been through the process themselves and will have had an expectation that their child would make the same transition. And there will be no exams this year. Students are relying on an assessment process to provide grades on which their access to higher education depends. I understand this will take in more than predicted grades, but there still remains the concern, to me at least, that because predicted grades have been shown in the past to discriminate against underprivileged and BME students, this will result in fewer getting into higher education this year. I would suggest that it would make it less likely that they were able to take advantage of adjustment this year. I know this process is used by Cambridge University to attract underprivileged students who have done better than they and their teachers expected. I touched earlier on extra barriers around support that face underprivileged children from getting to university. And as a former teacher, I've learned it's not just a lack of money or abilities, it's confidence, belief, even the idea of university itself. Some children really don't see university as a place they belong. They couldn't be a student. Putting those kids in places where they would never imagined themselves, where they would never otherwise have had the opportunity to be, and to help them realize for themselves that yes, they can do this, and yes, why not me? I know that it's so important and so effective. It's important to grow that self-belief, because getting into university is not the end of the story. Staying there is another challenge. And again, for these children, it is bigger than others. When things get tough, and they will, it makes giving up that much more easier if, in your heart of hearts, you feel you don't really belong there. Your failure was expected. That's why I was so impressed to learn that IntoUniversity supports children not just to get into university, but while they are there too. That the journey to and through university is also an emotional and psychological one, as well as an academic one. As a teacher, I think I've mentioned previously, we used to take children down to Parliament. I went on many visits down to visit Parliament, taking Year 6 pupils around there. And one of the things I would really, truly love to see is some of those pupils I took down to Parliament, believing that they themselves could be there and belong there too. And speaking as someone who was state school educated and had only visited Parliament with a group of children going on a tour, it is a very daunting prospect to be somewhere where there's lots of people come from a similar, come from a background where they're expected to be there. And you can see this when you, I remember one sitting there on the benches with one older Labour Party MP sat behind me, and this young Conservative Member of Parliament stood up and started speaking completely confidently, first speech he'd ever given in the House of Commons. And the Labour MP behind me leant forward and he says, blimey, he says, they're born to belong in here. He said, it took me 20 years before I could speak like that. And I thought it was a really interesting point, this feeling of whether you belong somewhere or whether you don't. I mentioned commuter students earlier, and I'd like to return to them as we consider the future. The economy is retracting, unemployment will rise as we attempt to find the new normal. Universities are going to have a central role in playing to both training a new generation and reskilling the older ones. We are likely to see an increase in commuter students. As it is, they make up 50% of the intake at some universities. Now, this wouldn't be a cause for concern if it weren't for the fact that they have poorer academic outcomes than their on-campus peers. If we're going to see an increase in their numbers, and in likelihood we are, then we really need to address this difference in outcomes. From what research says, there is no clear answer. The issue seems to not simply be those arising from the students being more likely to be from economic disadvantaged and BME groups. In fact, commuter students are not a homogenous group. They come from a variety of circumstances and backgrounds, and consequently very few universities collect data on them or necessarily recognise them as a group. The existing evidence seems to suggest the amount of engagement in activities beyond the lecture theatre has an effect, and that while the universities do not always appreciate the barriers to engagement and proactively encourage involvement, the students themselves do not always recognise the value in them. This is certainly an area I believe needs further attention, not least from the government, who at the time of the Augur report's commissioning were keen to increase commuter student numbers. One of the issues that I have been raising with government is looking at funding bite-sized courses and smaller modules. But at the moment, the student financial system is based on the idea that everybody wants to go full-time and do a 3-year course. If we start looking instead at bite-sized courses and modular courses and how we're going to fund them, we might encourage more people to think of going back into university. Because the idea, if you've been out of university for a very long time, and you, as a mature student, that you would commit to doing a 3-year degree would be incredibly daunting. And I think we need to look at making those smaller steps available and funding them. So as I said at the very beginning, while COVID-19 hasn't created many of the problems that we see, it has highlighted them. It shone the light on digital poverty, the problems that commuter students face, and the lack of adequate support from many students who are going to university for the very first time. These are not new problems. They're problems that we've dealt with and tried to grapple with for years. The one thing COVID-19 does is gives us the stimulus and the urgency for this conversation and this debate, and the desperate need to find solutions much more quickly than we have done in the past. And so unfortunately I can't stay for the whole debate today, but I really look forward to being part of this, listening to this first panel and learning from all of the experts on here, and hopefully working with you all in the future as we try and make university truly a place where everybody belongs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma. Absolutely. Some really dynamic proposal you discussed in there. And I think for everyone here at the conference today, COVID-19 really has allowed us to shine a light on so much of the disadvantage that exists. And then to your point, it is a fantastic time to take some of these challenges head on. And I think some of the questions that we'll now go into for about 5 or 10 minutes initially, and then hopefully we'll open up to the audience, we'll try and go into some of those points. So to start with, the theme of this conference is place-based working, and my first question would be closer to home for you. So looking at Castle and Hull West, are there any place-based initiatives for young people that you would like to see, or any existing ones which you think work particularly well that maybe should have more awareness?
There's a scheme actually through one of the local secondary schools which has been set up by the Hull and York Medical School, where they go into a secondary school to try and promote careers in health education with young people, and they do various activities. But my only criticism of this is, while it's very effective for that school, it is not based in all of the schools in Hull. So it's only available for one particular school, and without going down the Hull road and my soapbox around the fragmentation of the school system and how difficult that makes any of these initiatives, because you're not dealing with one local authority to arrange something, you're dealing with a number of different academy chains with different priorities and different expectations. So that makes everything very much harder. But I think what I really liked hearing from Rachel at the beginning was this working with incredibly young children. There's one other initiative, which isn't actually a university one, but I just want to mention very quickly, which is called WIME, which is Women in Manufacturing and Engineering. And what they do is they promote manufacturing and engineering to girls. And they've now started working with primary age children, because they've showed by the time people get to secondary age, they've already made up their mind about what kind of career they actually want to be involved in. And so you need to start working with children on a much younger age, which is why I was delighted when Rachel said they were working with, I think, 7-year-olds for IntoUniversity.
Sure, absolutely. I think that's one of the biggest differentiators for our charity, the fact that we start so early on in our community. So we're really glad that we are opening up a centre closer to home for you. Now moving on to a more national level, something that you tweeted about yesterday, saying that universities are facing a shortfall of up to 2 billion with a predicted 61% decrease in students from East Asia, end quote. At a time when large swaths of the university sector, as you mentioned in your keynote, are already struggling financially, what would you maybe say to universities who may look to save money by widening participation budgets?
Yeah, and this is one of the issues I had with the reallocation of funding from the student premium into the student hardship fund, which is one of the proposals that the government made, was I think it takes universities' attention away from widening participation. And I do understand, I have a lot of sympathy with the universities at the moment and the complete crisis that they're facing. But my real worry is, you look at sort of, again, you have to look back a bit, look at what's happening in schools around the attainment gap and how they think we've undone 10 years of progress in closing that attainment gap just because of what's happened in COVID-19. So I think we need to be thinking not just about this year's university students, but actually what more can we do to support? What about the current year 10s at the moment? They're going to have disruptions to their GCSEs next year. COVID's going to have an impact on widening participation for probably the next decade because of the impact that it's having on the schools right now. And whatever sort of plan the government try and introduce, they are not going to be able to close that gap in the foreseeable future. So I think universities do need to keep prioritising it, yes, this year, but also I would argue that we need to be investing more in it in years to come. It needs to become even more of a priority for universities, because this change is going to be coming through the school system. Those year 10s who've been impacted right now, this is going to come through the system, and this is going to be hitting universities in 3-4 years' time as well.
Absolutely, I think that's a really important point, because I've got a young brother in year 10 myself, and I can see just how much disruption this causes. So we hope that the government will come forward and make maybe some of the proposals around returning students to schools slightly more clear. And so another question which I think would be useful for the conference would be to look at a recent report that the London School of Economics Centre for Economic Performance put out, which concluded that the pandemic was going to damage the life prospects of all Britons under 25, but that the most affected demographic will be those under the age of 25. You've mentioned in previous interviews the idea of a legal right to learn. Could you maybe expand on that idea in the context of COVID-19 and how it might help address educational disadvantage?
Yeah, this is my favourite idea, which I have to stress is not official Labour Party policy. I do have to keep mentioning that because we haven't written our manifesto yet. But really the principle around it is if you give people this right to learn, and what would that look like in practice? And so one of the ideas I've been sort of playing with is this idea: if you find yourself unemployed and out of work, if you think about the industries that are going to be impacted by COVID-19, particularly hospitality trade and areas like that, and you go to a job centre and you present as being unemployed. Now, officially, the job coaches are meant to talk to you about the different opportunities that are made available for you. But the criteria for universal credit, and apologies if everyone knows this anyway, you've got to spend so many hours actively job hunting and evidence that you've spent so many hours job hunting to be eligible for universal credit. So to meet the criteria for universal credit, it would be fairly impossible to do any kind of full-time educational study, because you have to show that you spent all these hours hunting for jobs. Now, if you imagine this happened and Labour got in and we introduced this idea around a right to learn. Imagine if instead, when you showed up at that job centre and you had that conversation with your job coach, that you knew you had a right to learn, and you were able to say to that job coach instead, actually, I want to look at the education opportunities that there are in my local area. And instead of having to jump through all the hoops and hit the criteria for universal credit, you could instead say, well, you know, I'm exercising my right to learn, I instead want to go and study a full-time course in my local FE college or my local university to enable me to qualify in a different area. And this is the kind of idea where I'm thinking about it. And also, if you had this, imagine you had a right to learn and you were working at the moment in a job you didn't enjoy and you didn't particularly like. If you had this right to learn, you'd have a right to have time off to access learning and access training. And this is what, as I say, this is just one of my things I get quite excited about, and an idea I really like about how this would look. And there's a lot of work to do on it, sort of iron out exactly what this would look like and how it would work. But this is this idea of empowering people as individuals to exercise this as a right, so that you don't get trapped in a poor, low-paid job that you hate. You don't get trapped in some form of unemployment benefit where you're having to spend hours searching for jobs that just don't exist. Instead, you have this right that enables you to hopefully move on to something better.
We've now got some more questions coming in from the audience, and I'll go to a few of those. So Vicky Woodings has just asked, what do you think about the need for impartial quality careers guidance moving forward to support young people into higher education?
Yeah, so I missed the first bit, but I just caught it at the end. It was about careers advice. Yeah, I mean, what's happened in terms of careers, it's just been completely decimated. And, you know, I think we all miss having the qualified, experienced, highly trained careers advisors. And they're simply not there. And I don't want to sort of be too critical of the people who are working in the system we have at the moment. And it's no fault of theirs, but they're not highly qualified, trained, expert careers advisors. And I think that is part of the problem. And as I mentioned just earlier, we do have local initiatives like YME and different people trying to step in and fill this void, but that is completely missing. And one of the other ideas I was pondering around this, with this right to learn, was, if imagine, and someone is having this conversation is saying, when you see a qualified and trained careers advisor, you leave that experience feeling empowered and feeling like, wow, I could go do this, I could do this, you know, these are my options, I feel really good about myself. When you go and see and I won't say all, but what people have told me is, when you go and see a jobs coach in a job centre, you don't leave with that same sense of empowerment and excitement about, oh, I could do this, I could do this, I could do this. So imagine, and as again, this isn't Labour policy, but imagine if we had instead careers advisors down there in job centres, proper careers advisors that could look at somebody as a real individual and talk to them about the opportunities that they have in front of them. And maybe an impossible dream, but I think we shouldn't underestimate the importance of high quality careers advice, and it just doesn't exist in this country. I mean, unless schools individually pay for it themselves, it doesn't exist to the standard or quality that we need.
Okay. Emily Bailey's just asked a question about whether you anticipate an additional academic year for those groups, for those year 10, 11, 12s who've been most affected by COVID-19. If that's something that you could foresee happening, or do you have an opinion on this?
It's not something I've considered before, I'll be honest. It would be quite difficult in terms of logistics on where you'd put an extra year group in a school, in terms of the building and the number of classrooms and number of teachers. So it would be logistically very, very difficult. There's lots of talk about there being summer school and summer classes made available, which again, I think, having been a teacher, and obviously still friends with so many teachers right now and people I've worked with for years, they've all worked through the Easter holidays, they've all worked through the bank holidays, they haven't closed at all during this whole crisis. And I think the idea of expecting them to then open the school all through the summer holidays and then just keep going, I think is maybe ambitious. Instead, it might be good to look at education in a slightly different form and a different way of doing it, rather than expecting them just to continue to attend school. But something does have to be done. We do need to do something to address this growing gap. but it has to be done, whatever's decided has to be done in conjunction with teachers, through the teaching unions, and talking to parents as well, because I think whenever the government, and we'll see this imminently with the government's announcement that they're going to be making later on today, they're backtracking on when schools should open. I think when they just try and force something onto schools without fully understanding all of the difficulties involved and consulting widely the teaching profession, it will blow up in their face. Sorry.
I've got one more question that we'll quickly get in. We've got 2 minutes to go. You were recently asked what would be the first issue in higher education you would address if you became universities minister, and you replied you would plan for an alternative funding model. So my question is there room in these alternative plans to maybe reopen the debate around university grants for lower income students to tackle, as you said, the current situation where those with the greatest disadvantage leave uni with the greatest debt?
Yeah, and I should say, because I noticed I was quoted as said it was the first thing I would do. It was one of the first things I would do. But yes, we do need to look at a funding model for universities, because I think a lot of the behaviour that we disagree with that universities show is driven by the funding model in which they have to exist. You know, this need for an ever increasing number of international students, this kind of aggressive competitiveness against neighbours, this lack of collaboration. A lot of these behaviours are driven because of the way that universities are funded. And we can't, on one hand, criticise them for showing these behaviours, and at the other hand say, well, if you don't act in an aggressively competitive way, you're not going to survive. You know, we need to look at an alternative model. And you know, Labour Party have always said that we don't think students should have tuition fees. There is something perverse about a system where students from the most disadvantaged background leave with the highest level of debt. I mean, that's not fair. I mean, whatever people think or don't think about tuition fees, I think most people accept that's not a fair system. That's not the best way in which we could do things. I do think we need to be looking at the entire way higher education is funded, and recognise that higher education are, yes, they're autonomous, and yes, in some ways they are private businesses, but they're not businesses. They're also public institutions that show and demonstrate a public good in their wider community. So the way that, the way that the government are treating them at the moment just as a business, go and get a business interruption loan, go and get finances in the way any other business does, I don't think recognises their importance, and they're public bodies as well. And so I think we need a whole new model. We need a new way of looking at it, and a way that still, you know, stresses the importance of a high quality experience for students, because I don't think that we should necessarily go back to where students were an afterthought in what a university does. I think students should be still front and centre in what the universities exist for and their reason for being. But I think if we want higher education to collaborate with FE, to collaborate with schools, to work more in their local environment, then we need a funding model that doesn't set them up in competition to it.
Absolutely. Well, I think we've all really enjoyed that session. Thank you so much for answering some of those questions in the keynote. And now we're going to hand over to Hugh, who will be chairing the first part of the conference. Thank you so much for coming, Emma. And
No worries.
Good morning, and welcome to the first of our panels. My name is Hugh Rayment-Pickard. I'm one of the founders of IntoUniversity. Thank you all, wherever you are, working from home or if you're working in your office, thank you for being with us today. This is the first of two panels that we've got today. This panel is going to be reflecting on the civic role and identity of universities, thinking about, in particular, the relationship universities have with and the responsibilities they have for the communities around them. And we couldn't have a better panel of panelists to help us think through these issues. Richard Brabner is director of the UPP Foundation. The UPP Foundation is itself a charity that offers grant support to universities, charities, and other higher education bodies. Its ambitious aim is to tackle the biggest issues facing the higher education sector across the UK. Last week, Richard wrote about a new spirit of civic endeavour that he's seen arising during lockdown. He wants Britain to build on this spirit by creating a civic army of 75,000 young people who will carry out tasks in their local communities. And he wants universities to step up their outreach efforts to support these young people in their journey to higher education and other positive post-school destinations. Hilai Qahari is a member of IntoUniversity's Student Advisory Panel, and she's joining us for the Q&A session of this panel. She's a final year law student at Brunel University, and she's also one of the university's famed student success advisors. Hilai attended our Brent Centre and has completed several IntoUniversity programmes, including our Big City Bright Future summer internship with BlackRock. Her ambition is to become a solicitor or a civil servant, or to work in legal compliance. Professor Charlie Jeffrey is Professor of Politics, and he's a relatively recently appointed Vice-Chancellor of the University of York. His first year as Vice-Chancellor has had its challenges. You may remember back in February this year that the university had to cope with having one of the first cases of coronavirus. One of Professor Jeffrey's research interests is the idea of Englishness, and he's urged political scientists and policymakers to take England seriously because people's sense of national belonging has a powerful influence on their outlook. And before taking up his post at York, Professor Jeffrey was Vice Principal at the University of Edinburgh, and I think he will be talking today a little bit about his experience of the relationship to the University of Edinburgh and Edinburgh City. And finally, Pete Bruce is a former modern languages teacher who joined the University of Nottingham's widening participation team in 2016, where he is head of student recruitment outreach. We work very closely with Pete and his colleagues in Nottingham, where we have 3 IntoUniversity centres, as well as a team working on UniConnect. Before I hand over to the first of the panellists, I wanted just to share with you two anecdotes from our experience of getting IntoUniversity started. When we were first starting out to expand IntoUniversity from its roots in North Kensington, I was introduced to a senior figure at a London University college. I asked whether the college might be interested in helping us to develop our work in Hackney, and he shrugged. The thing you have to understand, he said, is that this institution is interested in global talent. Hackney isn't more special than anywhere else. Students in Hong Kong are as important as students from Hackney. This was almost certainly an exaggeration, but I did think it captured some element of truth of the tension within the idea of a university between the universal and the local. And on another occasion, we were trying to set up our centre in Brighton, and we held a public meeting in the church hall, which we were hoping to rent as premises. And we had a lot of very, very negative feedback from people at that meeting, wondering what we were doing there, what was the centre about. And one of the comments made by one of the participants was that this community had never really had universities taking an interest in them like this before, and it wasn't really very relevant to them. The irony of this is that that particular church hall, when you stand outside the front doors, you can see the University of Brighton, which says that even if you're based physically within a community, I think as Emma was saying earlier, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have an emotional connection or a sense of common purpose if you're not part of the social and other networks of the university. So I'm now going to hand over to the members of our panel to speak briefly, and then we'll have a broader session of Q&A. The first person I'm going to ask to speak is Pete Bruce. Over to you, Pete.
Let's try again, sorry. Thanks, Hugh. So let me start by talking about a young person in Nottingham. We'll call her Halima. It's not a real name, but that's what we'll call her. So back in 2015, when Halima started in Year 7, she had the dubious pleasure of having me as her German teacher. Now, Helene was possibly one of the quietest and least confident students I've ever taught. While she always got her work done and she did it well, she would literally never offer an answer in class. And if ever I directed a question to her, she always looked like she wanted the ground to swallow her up. However, as the year went on, I noticed that Halima gradually became more and more confident, finding her feet in class, and that was really fantastic to see. And shortly after the Easter of that academic year, I joined the WP team at the university, and I visited one of the 3 IU centres that we have in Nottingham, and I was delighted to find that Halima had been a regular attendee at their academic support after school sessions, and had been receiving one-to-one mentoring from one of our committed university students throughout that academic year, and had specifically been working on developing her confidence. And it was fantastic to meet Halima again that June and at the mentoring celebration at the university, and to chat to her family, who were clearly thrilled with the difference that the mentoring and the academic support sessions were making to Halima. Now, I tell the story as I think it captures the impact that place-based work can have on the young people in our less advantaged communities. Will Halima end up as a student at our university? Possibly, but not at all guaranteed, and I think that's okay. Given IntoUniversity's own impact data, I think there's a very high chance that she will end up studying at a university. Would she have come along to weekly academic support sessions if we'd held them at the university campus? Difficult to know for sure, but I would doubt it. Would she have travelled to campus to receive the weekly one-to-one mentoring from a university student? Again, I would very much doubt it. Because you see, these young people, they turn up week in, week out to their IntoUniversity centre because the centres are based in their communities. And are sort of a very well-respected part of their communities. And at the University of Nottingham, we're hugely proud to be entering our 10th year of partnership with IntoUniversity, and it's a partnership that has enabled us to work collaboratively to support young people and to contribute to addressing educational inequality in 3 less advantaged communities in our city. And over the course of that partnership, over 500 university student volunteers have committed over 5,000 hours of one-to-one mentoring at the IU centres in the heart of these communities. Countless academics and student groups have delivered academic sessions at these centres, and as a result of the partnership, we've welcomed thousands of young people and their parents onto campus. And to me, this is an example of really of the Civic University in action. And I think essentially we want local young people to come and, if we want local young people to come and study at our universities, and local communities to engage with our research and understand what we do and why, we can't just sit and wait for them to cross our thresholds and drive through our entrance barriers. We surely need to get out into our communities, to engage with people, to look for ways to work together, not in any sort of top-down way, but together to improve lives and work to deliver transformative change. And it's with that goal that back in January, the University of Nottingham and Nottingham Trent University launched together the Universities for Nottingham initiative, which is essentially about working to agree a set of priorities for joint civic activity, and then working with partners to deliver that transformative change. So as a university, we're committed to supporting that place-based work in the city, and as well as our partnerships that I've already mentioned with IntoUniversity. We have a really strong programme of activity with local schools and colleges, which starts also as early as Key Stage 1 with targeted local primary schools. And that work starts out in the communities, in the primary schools, building up relationships with those schools over time and offering opportunities to them. Now, we obviously can't call that pure student recruitment work, although it would be amazing to think, and not impossible to think, that 10 years down the line, some of these children we work with at primary level end up coming to study with us. But this is very much, for me, about civic engagement as part of that commitment to contributing towards addressing the issues of educational disadvantage. We have a strong family learning programme, again, partly in partnership with IntoUniversity. And then we continue to work with local young people at pre and post-16 level with various programmes designed to raise aspirations, to develop skills and to support attainment raising. And this includes our sustained pre-16 cohort-based programme and 2 summer schools for local year 12 students. And obviously the closer we get to post-16 level, our aim is, of course, to encourage young people from disadvantaged backgrounds to apply to and thrive at our own institution, but if not, to also consider studying at any university as a realistic and achievable goal. And I think widening participation and outreach work surely has to be more than just pure recruitment to our own institution, although obviously that and access and participation plan targets are hugely important. We have the opportunity to contribute educational opportunity to improving educational opportunity and social mobility, but more needs to be done. And the work goes on, and as Emma talked about this morning, has just become even more essential in light of the current pandemic situation. Thanks to you.
Very many thanks, Pete. I'm now going to hand over to Professor Charlie Jeffrey, who's going to give us some insights into Civic University.
Many thanks indeed, Hugh. Delighted to be part of this panel. The premise of the panel, as I read it, is twofold. First, that universities can make a real difference through place-based work to address educational disadvantage. But second, and that's why we're having the panel, we're not yet doing all that we could with as much impact as we could. So what could and should we do more? Let me first offer 2 thoughts on why we might not always achieve the impact that we could. And the first lies with us in the universities, so the second lies with our regulatory environment. And my university, the University of York, is a civic university through and through. It was the product of a civic campaign led by local organisations, funded by local people. Those campaigns gave us not just the economic purpose that lay behind the expansion of universities in the 1960s, but also a moral one. Through our work, we were, I quote, to contribute to the amelioration of human life and conditions. Our current terminology for that is that we exist for public good. And part of that has always been about widening access, to borrow the words of our first Vice-Chancellor. That is something we should care about more than almost anything else. And we pursue those concerns genuinely and with passion in communities in and around the city, in many, many initiatives with many, many local organisations. So many, perhaps, that we don't always see the wood for the trees, that we don't always add up to more than the sum of the parts of our activities, so that we don't maximise the impact from our commitment to public good. And I'll come back to that in a minute. A second factor limiting our impact is the regulatory environment we face in our work to widen access. This has 2 structural faults. The first is that it's over-focused on the point of admission to university. And we all know that patterns of educational disadvantage are set in the very early years of life and have lifelong consequences. What universities can do is only part of a systemic problem that can't be fully addressed until there is a systemic solution. And a second structural fault is that our regulatory environment too often nurtures a one-sizeism, with every university developing sets of activities to respond to regulation that look like pretty much everybody else's. And I fear that can often stifle creativity. Now, thinking harder about place offers a solution to these problems. It can give us focus to our work in universities with our local communities. It can build solutions which connect across primary, secondary, tertiary, and lifelong education, creating a systemic effect locally. And because of all this is fitted to particular local circumstances, it can escape that one-sizeism, notwithstanding our regulatory environment. Now, this was an approach I was able to develop in Edinburgh, where I worked until last summer. where we designed and won funding for a very ambitious economic development program, which on the one hand worked with government and industry to harness cutting-edge research and graduate talent to the development of the regional tech sector. And on the other hand, it built a coordinated approach across the region's universities with different missions, as Pete was saying is happening in Nottingham, with the region's further education colleges, and with a network of demonstrator schools in disadvantaged communities, so that we together could craft pathways designed to widen up access to opportunities in those new tech-driven economic sectors. And it's that kind of ecosystem approach, an approach that recognizes that impact is maximized if different organizations align their activities effectively, that I'm keen to develop now. I'm in York. And we at the University of York are working with York St John University and the two local further education colleges and local authorities in and around York to identify, nurture and support those sectors which will drive future economic development. And we're working to ensure that we collectively ensure that pathways that enables those from disadvantaged backgrounds to achieve their potential are open. There's something there which we should really recognize as universities. We have a convening power. We are generally respected. We can bring organizations together for collective benefit. Three final points, Hugh, if I may. The first is that all of this is all the more important now, given the economic damage being inflicted by the COVID-19. We must work to support recovery from the impact of the crisis in our communities. Second point is about the definition of place. For me, this isn't only about the city of York. The city of York's a relatively prosperous city, but about mitigating educational disadvantage nearby. In coastal communities, which are very much a cold spot of deprivation, in places which have seen deindustrialization to the north on Teesside, to the west in the Pennines, and to the south on the Humber. And in the latter case, we have a very strong relationship with the University of Hull. That ecosystem approach can extend across different places, and we're looking to develop that further. And my third point connects to this wider definition of place. University of York isn't as ethnically diverse as it could be, and York as a city is a very white city. And I fear that widening access programs in the past have had too localized a perspective. They've been beset by a view that students from disadvantaged backgrounds will not travel, and that we in effect have a limited catchment. I think that has limited our impact. It could say to us that more diverse communities, say in Bradford and elsewhere in West Yorkshire, 40 miles away, are beyond our reach. I think that's wrong. I think we have to challenge that view and deepen our engagement with and commitment to underrepresented groups living nearby. Our sense of place might need to be stretched. And for me, the events of the last weeks in the US and now in the UK too make all this more pressing. We need to think harder still about the experience, disadvantage and discrimination faced by people of colour. And we in universities need to be bolder and more resolute in making our institutions as open and as welcoming as possible. And for that, we might need to stretch what we mean by our place. Thank you very much, Hugh.
Thank you very much indeed, Charlie. And our final words of input are from Richard Brabner. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you, Hugh. And it's absolutely brilliant to be here and speaking at the IntoUniversity conference. I'm really impressed. I love Into because it's a place-based charity which is supporting access and widening participation to university. And I suppose as a funder of WP activities, and I say this as a Londoner myself, often some of the really innovative and new and young civil society sort of charities which support access do come from London, and I suppose a challenge to them is often how you become more place-based and support a wider geography in the UK, and it's brilliant to see that happen at Into over the years, and great to hear from Emma earlier about the new scheme that you've got up at Hull. Hugh obviously mentioned who we are. We just as a brief intro, because I know there's many people on the call that won't know who the UPP Foundation is. We were set up just a few years ago in 2016. We're what you would call a corporate foundation. We are funded by a student accommodation provider called University Partnerships Programme, and they provide the foundation with an annual donation each year. But we're an independent charity in our own right. And we both give grants to universities and to charities to fund pilot projects. And we also do some public policy and thought leadership work too. And I think why I've been asked to speak today is because our most substantial piece of work in terms of public policy to date has been the Civic University Commission, which we ran in 2018, 2019. And Hugh obviously mentioned the report which we published last week, and I hope to talk about that in more detail in the Q&A. But I wanted to go back really to talk about the Commission, because I know there'll be a number of people on the conference today that won't necessarily know much about it and what it was. And as Rachel and others have mentioned, the sort of impact of COVID is really increasing the difficulties that we've got in the country that are already existing. And I think some of the things that the Commission touched upon is only going to become more important as we understand the real impact of the pandemic. So the Commission was set up as a response really to the issues of place, which have become much more prominent in our national debate since the financial crisis, the resulting austerity, and of course the Brexit referendum. And to give you some context, the Commission was really looking at the role universities obviously play in their local communities, but trying to reimagine it for the 21st century and help our institutions think about the impact they have across all of the aspects of what a university does to the economic, social, cultural well-being of disadvantaged places. Like a select committee inquiry, we had Lord Kerslake, the former head of the civil service, who chaired it, and a number of high-profile commissioners from inside and outside of HE. And it, like a select committee inquiry, it asked a number of experts to provide all evidence across a range of issues. So yes, what's relevant today, so widening participation, attainment, adult education in your locality, but also looked at things like the industrial strategy, relationship with local government, the role as an economic anchor, the relationship with the NHS, how they support cultural and arts organisations and so on in their communities. And those evidence sessions were supplemented by both smaller private events put on by universities, lots of written submission from the sector, focus groups and polling work. And the first thing to note at the end of that process was that we found that universities across the board do an incredible amount of inspiring civic engagement, partnerships and programs with colleges, museums, charities, businesses, schools and so on to support their local communities. And I think it's really important that we do make that statement first and make it clear. And our commission, there were 12 main recommendations which looked across those themes. But the main recommendation, which was a challenge and sort of links into what Charlie was talking about, was about the strategic approach universities make to their local areas. While we saw lots of brilliant initiatives, what the Commission didn't really find was a civic role based on the real needs of its place, what you'd call a strategic approach based on a robust analysis of its local area, developed in real partnership with communities and other local institutions. Essentially what happened, we thought, was the civic role often had been developed based on a menu of activity. And while to some extent there isn't a problem with that, and actually some of that is very good, particularly the organically led programs developed by very entrepreneurial members of staff and students, it has left a gap, and which led the Commission to recommend for universities to develop what we called civic university agreements. And these are essentially place-based strategies published as public commitments to your civic role, co-produced with a local community, and essentially allowing the local community and other institutions to help shape you, in partnership with you, with the focus that your universities can provide in terms of your civic role. So far, 60 Vice-Chancellors have made that commitment to developing a CUA. So as a small foundation to have galvanised the sector-wide movement for reprioritising that civic role across all types of universities across all parts of the UK is a really pleasing result. Following the work of the Commission, and to help universities embed this further, recently we've established the Civic University Network. And this is a body, seed funded by us, the DFE, Arts Council England and the Carnegie UK Trust, and hosted at Sheffield Hallam. And it's a sector-led initiative which has been established to support best practice in 3 ways. Typical practice activities, such as events, toolkits and so on, networks, which many of you will be involved in. It is going to develop a peer review scheme for those agreements to support enhancement and learning. And importantly, I think for members of the conference, it's going to have a real big advocacy role. So not just to government, but to other sectors too. And we've seen over recent years, other sectors really strategically thinking about place, whether it's the NHS, whether it's school system, whether it's FE, whether it's arts and culture. That network will help connect those in universities that are thinking about place with other sectors too. And of course, launched in the midst of this pandemic, there's a real critical role for the network in supporting institutions thinking about how they can help their local communities, not just now, but over the medium to longer term, overcome the challenges from the crisis. Now, before I finish, I just want to draw on what the Commission and subsequent work has talked of in terms of place-based approach to educational opportunity. And as we've heard, this is now even more important as a result of the pandemic and the impact of the pandemic, which the Educational Endowment Foundation estimates will widen the attainment gap by over 30%, reversing gains made over the last decade. Now, quickly, there are probably a number of roles, but there are 3 direct roles that universities play here. The first, as we've heard about, is the role of your WP activity, particularly focused on not just your local community, but of course your region, which many of you, of course, will do. But thinking about the lessons from the Civic University movement to ensure that you have a robust analysis of your local area to really target those who will benefit from your WP support, and making sure you can evidence your impact, but also distinguish between your WP activity and your direct recruitment activity. Second, and importantly, is the role in raising attainment, clearly linked but separate to WP. Now, I don't need to tell any of you how important this is to educational opportunity. And many of your institutions will provide things like contextual offers and have developed partnerships with colleges and others for transition programs and so on. And of course, this is all really vital, as is the work that you do to support schools. And we've heard a number of great examples of how institutions support the governance of schools, help with curriculum design, providing resources and facilities. And I think in the midst of this pandemic, importantly, is the tutoring and mentoring programs that you're going to be putting on, utilising the skills of your staff, but also your students too. And thirdly, your role in providing skills and lifelong learning, particularly in a growing age of automation. Now, we haven't got time necessarily right now to delve into the decline of adult education over the last 10 to 20 years, but this is really central to the government's levelling up agenda, and there are going to be opportunities here for your institutions and others, particularly around technical and professional education. And certainly, if you looked at the Tory Party manifesto, they certainly linked the civic role with the growth of adult education very clearly. So in all 3 roles, obvious to say, but partnership with FE and the wider educational ecosystem will be really vital. I'm going to stop there. Delighted to talk about our new report in the discussion, and look forward to the questions.
Very many thanks, Richard. Before we tackle some of the issues that have been raised, I'd really like to bring us back to the student experience and ask Hilai about her experience of geography. Hilai, you were a student at our Brent Centre, and your decision to go to university was to travel not to the other side of the country, but to continue your studies in West London. How important for you was it to go to a local university, or was that just an accident? That's it.
Okay, got it. Hello. I initially was very keen on staying local because it would have obviously helped me with commuting. It's easier because I have my family here. I can arrive on timings. But I think just going outside of the zone, so going outside of my local community to West London, it was kind of an eye-opener because I got to see more things, just seeing the local area, the university, the opportunities out there. Because I believe nowadays most opportunities are far. You have to actually go to the extent of going far to achieve those. And I first went to Brunel University in year 8. It was a open day, which was hosted for my school, and we got to carry out different activities there, and just seeing the whole university life, the campus life, the things that were present there, having idea about the courses really attracted me. And I thought that it's best to actually move somewhere where there's vast amount of opportunities. But in that essence, Brunel in itself does not limit itself in terms only providing support and advice for its students at university. From the years that I've been with Brunel, it's taken a lot of initiatives of helping different local communities and schools with special needs in terms of like providing them with support. That is done all through volunteering. And so I think volunteering is the best way to ensure that we provide that support, because then there's not expectation that there's a funding problem, there's resources problem. So yeah.
Thank you, Hilai. Charlie, you mentioned the question about travelling, students being prepared to travel to go to the right university. Do you feel, though, perhaps that part of the rhetoric about university participation has been a heroic narrative that a young person should leave their mother and father and their home and travel across the country, to go to some far-off place and study there, and that perhaps that narrative has been at the expense of another story, which is that you grow up in a local community, you go to your local university, you develop skills and qualifications that allow you then perhaps to continue working within that community. Much more the somewheres argument that people could combine higher education aspiration with belonging to a particular place.
That's a really interesting point, Hugh, and we're really quite strange in the UK in that tradition of moving away from home to go to university. It's not normally the experience in continental Europe and in large parts of the US. Beyond some of the most high-profile universities, it's not the case, and perhaps we do obsess a little bit about that. And one of the reasons perhaps why we see talent exported from places rather than rooted in places. However, I do think that's changing, and that's partly a resource-driven change because of the changes to higher education fees and funding in the last 10 years and more. We currently have something like 400 or 500 commuting students at the University of York, and that means from a relatively near distance. And if you take a kind of radius of 1 hour's travel from York, you do reach those coastal communities I talked about. You do reach Teesside, you do reach the Humber, you do reach West Yorkshire. And I'm delighted that we're seeing that trend begin to happen. And it challenges us as well. We were a university set up in the 1960s precisely to get people from other parts of the country to come to us. We have to think differently when part of our recruitment becomes more local. We've had a variant of a college system where students have a social community around their hall of residence, which is a bit more intensive than most other universities have. But if we have commuting students, that doesn't really work because you never live in that environment. So our colleges are now providing services, providing affiliations, providing support to students who commute to us. I think that's a really positive thing. I think it's really positive for the wider area around us, and I'm determined we nurture it more.
Richard, can I come to you to pick up on your proposal? You want the Chancellor to write out a cheque for £500 million so that you can mobilise this civic army of 75,000 young people. Can you tell us what this is all about and why you think it's important?
Yes, and it's not just us. There are a number of other organisations that are thinking along similar lines. As I think everyone here will appreciate, the economic or the employment impact of the pandemic is going to particularly affect 18 to 25-year-olds, as our previous recessions have shown, which demonstrate there isn't just an impact on the immediate employment of those 18 to 24-year-olds, it also has a longer-term scarring effect on both their employment prospects and what they earn in future years too. And so therefore, we combining that with the educational issues around from COVID, we think that there needs to be a real national effort to help young people overcome these challenges. And so we have come up with an idea where you can utilise this renewed civic endeavour, which we've seen from the response to this crisis up and down the country. People are volunteering to support not just the NHS, but their local communities, and of course universities. Their staff and students have been really at the heart of that effort. And we think if we can continue that endeavour, and you could get the government to pay for a 6-month programme where unemployed young people from disadvantaged backgrounds would be paid on a full-time basis to support their local communities, deliver projects in their local communities. And this programme would also pay for students from poorer backgrounds on a part-time basis, because we know that there are real concerns around the employment prospects for students from poorer backgrounds who rely on that part-time income to get them through their studies. Now, if you could have a scheme such as that, which pays for young people to do great work in their local community, you could basically support their future employability and employment and ensure that they have good educational outcomes too. I hope that's a sort of clear summary, but I'm happy to talk about it.
Thank you, Rich, and I think your report has been made available to all the participants, so people can follow up. One of the questions from one of the attendees is to do with FE colleges. I know that from the work that we're doing to get some centres established in Scotland, but in Scotland the colleges play a much bigger part in tertiary education and higher education. Pete, I wondered, from your experience in Nottingham and also your experience as a teacher, do you think that we are using FE colleges enough to help address the issues young people are facing?
I mean, I think we've got a lot more to do. The universities and FE colleges joining up and working together far more. I know our other Nottingham University, Nottingham Trent University, they're working very closely now with a college in Mansfield and providing foundation degrees there, the Vision West Nottinghamshire College, a real strong partnership there. Not too far from Nottingham, but in a place of need. So I think that there's much more that we can do and should be doing to work together and support those young people that are wanting to get the higher education experience, but through their FE colleges, certainly.
Hilai, several of the contributors so far have referred to the consequences of COVID for young people. Richard feels that the government needs to act in a much more decisive way to do something. Unemployment prospects seem to be affected, young people's learning has been affected. Could you just comment on, from your perspective, how does the world look for you in terms of the ways in which things have been, your life has been affected by the lockdown?
It might be drastic to say, but it's like a wave. It's just, there's this sudden change has brought things with it that are very unexpected. So since I'm in my final year, it means I have more pressure in terms of my assignments, dissertation, exams. Luckily, I was good with assignments, dissertation, but when it came to exams, it meant that with the lockdown, I had to give online exams, and with those had extra factors that contributed. So compared to just sitting exams in whole, I had to do it at home, and that means I had extra noise, disturbances, so that could affect my performance. And also, I will be graduating this year, but might be most likely that I'll be graduating by Skype, and that's an experience that I was hoping not to get, but it's something that I can't avoid. And there's also, even though like we're all trying to stay positive, there's also a lot of uncertainty in terms of like the employability. So like, because the employability rate is increasing, I have this concern that what are my chances that I could beat someone who maybe have like higher qualification or comes from a different background. And like many students, I'm also continuing my qualification education in September to start my LPC. But because of this whole situation, I'm thinking whether should I defer it and wait until next year, or should I start now? Would it be worth going through my LPC, which will be self-funded, and go through it online? Would it benefit me in the same way if it was face-to-face? Can it motivate me? And this is the experience with many year 13s as well, whether they want to start their first year, whether they will actually have that university experience, which they assume for the rest of their lives. It's like, these are the challenges that are coming through, but I think it's best at this moment, it's best to stay positive and like just grasp all the opportunities there are. There are a lot of online virtual opportunities in terms of like internships, skills development, and then university itself as well. I think there's a lot of support, hopefully there would be, in terms of like well-being, lectures, and just ensuring that the student lives that university experience. The first one.
Thank you, Hilai. Well, I think the slogan "Staying Positive" is a very good point at which for us to draw the panel to a close, and for me to thank Charlie Jeffrey, Pete Bruce, Richard Brabner, and Hilai Qahari for their contribution. We now have a very welcome 10-minute rest, break to go make yourself a cup of coffee, and we're going to reconvene at 10 minutes past 11. Thank you all very much. Welcome back to everybody who's at IntoUniversity's Being There conference, addressing educational disadvantage through place-based working. I hope you've all had an opportunity to get yourself a cup of tea or some refreshment. And I'm now going to hand over to Pasha Michaelsen, who is a member of IntoUniversity's Trustee Board, who's going to chair our second panel, and Pasha will introduce herself and the panel members. Thank you, Pasha.
Thank you, Hugh. It's a great privilege to be here today. As Hugh said, my name is Pasha. I'm one of the trustees at IntoUniversity. And long before sitting in front of all of you today, I was a young girl growing up in rural South Carolina. I am American, attending my own local state schools where the odds sort of felt stacked against someone with my background, and particularly living in the place that I was living. So, you know, that said, I had the privilege of being surrounded and supported by people whose aspirations for me were much higher than I dared to dream. So I think it's in that context that I became the first member of my own family to go to university, where I went to Harvard and then on through legal studies. So we are really excited to have our panelists here today to sort of gain more insight, especially for me in a UK context here, on how funders and policymakers can deploy resources and policies to address educational disadvantage and hopefully significantly increase social mobility in specific places. So the first person that I want to introduce today is Tim Young. And Tim comes to us from the Rank Foundation, where he's been since 2007. The Rank Foundation is an organization that with a focus on place-based work, particularly in the areas of Hull, Dundee, and Plymouth. So Tim is the Director of Education Fellowship. He oversees the School Leadership Award, Community Action Placements, and the Rank Fellowship. And before working with the Rank Foundation, Tim was in teaching for about 30 years, working in the UK, New Zealand, and California. And he was headmaster of the Royal Grammar School in Guildford. Our second panelist today is David Johnston. And David comes to us from Parliament as a member of the House Commons Education Select Committee. And by way of background, David was born in a council estate. He went to a comprehensive school where only 21% passed any 5 GCSEs during his time there. And from this humble start, David succeeded in becoming the first person in his family to go to university. Today, he is MP for Wantage and Didcot, having been elected to Parliament in 2019. And David's decision to enter politics came after he voted to leave in the EU referendum, and his feeling that the issues he cared deeply about were being neglected whilst the arguments over Brexit dominated everything. One of the issues that David cares deeply about is supporting disadvantaged young people to get a better education and a good job. So prior to politics, David was the chief executive of the Social Mobility Foundation, and in 2018, he received an OBE for services to social mobility and education. So a warm welcome to both Tim and David today. I think I'll first ask Tim to speak a little bit on the topic or the theme of today's conference, and then David will come over to you.
Thank you very much, Pasha. I'm always anxious at being thought of as being an expert on a panel. I've really been looking forward to hearing from others this morning, and in particular the national reach of IntoUniversity and David's hugely impressive work with the Social Mobility Foundation. My personal definition of place-based work would be collaborative intervention in one place with the aim of achieving individual and collective empowerment and sustainability. And I'd approach the question of place-based work from 2 perspectives. First, my role as Director of Education for the Rank Foundation. The Rank Foundation is the grant-giving trust founded by J. Arthur Rank in 1953, which distributes the income from his wealth, which was generated by his work in flour, in film, and in photocopying. And the Foundation's work in place as a grant giver concentrates funding, knowledge, and expertise in one place, while at the same time continuing to fund a huge range of charities across the UK. But by doing so in one place, the Foundation aims to support local initiatives and build a local network.
connecting local organisations with each other and with the wider landscape. The aim is community development, creating a whole which is greater than the sum of the individual organisations. The Foundation's place-based work began in various places in 2003, but it's been significant and structured since 2013, with 6 years in Hull, which ended in 2019, 4 years in Dundee, which is still going on, and 2 years fairly recently started in Plymouth. The size of the city is key for us. Both Hull and Plymouth have around 250,000 inhabitants, and Dundee just less than 150,000. And we've been fortunate in our timing. Hull was awarded the 2017 City of Culture shortly after we started there, and the V&A, magnificent building, opened in Dundee during our time there. I think we've been less fortunate for the city's football teams. Every city has seen its football team relegated in the first year of our funding. The funding takes 6 years, and it tends to be slimmed down after the first phase of 3 years. From 21 projects in Hull, we slimmed down to 9 for the second phase, less so in Dundee, where we slimmed down from 21 to 20 local charities supported. And the network of local charities is deliberately broad, and the criterion is dynamic leadership of a small charity. It's usually a small charity. So it's only broadly educational, but my role is to link with local schools, local education providers, and also to link the young people on our leadership award scheme with the wide landscape of voluntary work in the community. Just to flesh out briefly how the Foundation works in a particular place, we appoint associates, local associates who have a deep local background and network, who are able to validate and strengthen the local collaborating organisations. They hold coordinating meetings every quarter, and they report back to the executive and the trustees on progress. In Hull, we appointed a retiring chief inspector in the police force. In Dundee, we appointed the retiring chief executive of Dundee Council, and our associate in Plymouth is the retired principal and CEO of the City College there. So these are significant local associates who run our efforts there. We also look to build on particular local interests, rugby league and fishing in Hull, football and comics and journalism in Dundee, things which connect young people with activities, role models, which act as bridging activities. Now, our Community Action Placement Scheme is right at the heart of our Leadership Award programme, which runs in year 12 and in year 13. Our award holders have 2 weeks on placement in dynamic community projects away from home, usually in areas of deprivation, Bootle, Kirby, the Homewood Estate outside Bradford, and St Michael's Youth Project in Hull, which is on the Orchard Park Estate, which is among the 5 most deprived wards out of 7,500 nationally. And this is a transformative education for young people. It gives them an immersive experience of leadership in the charitable sector. So moving on to my second perspective on place-based work, and this is the diverse educational opportunities provided by an informal network of 8 educational charitable organisations whose CEOs have met 3 times in the past 2 months to discuss how we might collaborate effectively. Between us, we can provide free of charge a range of educational opportunity for young people in areas of educational disadvantage. And we are the Rank Foundation, a broad leadership programme along with financial support for university. IntoScience UK, which provides STEM inspiration and connections through work placements and skills days, encouraging young people into STEM degrees and careers. The Talent Foundry, which provides life skills and employability development opportunities. Action Tutoring, which partners high quality volunteer tutors with pupils. The Young Carers Development Trust, which seeks to improve the life chances of young carers by individual mentoring and educational guidance. First Give, which inspires and equips school year groups to take action to tackle social issues. A partner organisation of IntoUniversity, which is the Royal National Springboard Foundation, which provides a fully funded boarding school education. And Next Step Education, a structured and tutored online programme to prepare young people for applying to and studying at university. So each of these charities has its own place-based operation, but we're able to share our experiences in particular areas, and that enables the expanding geographical reach of each charity, improves the effectiveness of each, and makes a collective educational endeavour possible. And we're looking to use some ideas from the Rank Foundation's playbook, as well as what's worked for each of us in our own areas. So we're looking at local leaders, whether in schools or community organisations, associates with strong local background and connections, and events which showcase the collective offer and which bring together beneficiaries, alumni, partners, schools and universities. So I hope that gives a flavour of my own experience of place-based work. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. And we'll move on to David.
Well, thanks very much. Briefly, I was chief exec of the SMF for 10 years, and from about 2014, we started opening offices around the country, having been in London until that time. And the reason we did so was because whatever London's challenges, the opportunities that almost everyone else in the country gets are fewer than those in London. And obviously there are particular hotspots for London like Tower Hamlets, but it was clear almost anywhere else you went, they weren't seeing the same type of activity that we were offering: work experience, mentoring, skills workshops, career workshops, and so on. And so we opened during my time 6 offices around the country. But the other thing we did was start residential programs with leading employers, where we brought people from all over the country to London. Now, the reason we did that is because every time we opened an office in a new location, we wanted to do it somewhere where there was enough population, enough employers to try and make that office work. And of course, in sparsely populated areas of the country, it's much harder to justify putting the resources into a permanent office in those places. So by the time I'd left, we were helping about 7,000 young people a year through these programs. And for anyone who's interested in place-based work, I think one of the best things you can look at if you're trying to work out where you should go is the Social Mobility Commission's State of the Nation report in 2017. Now, I was on the commission for 5 years, and a couple of times we ranked all the areas in England, only England because that's where you can get the data for, from best life chances to worst life chances. So number 1 is Westminster, and bottom 324 both years was West Somerset. And it's really important, and it helped to inform the government's approach on opportunity areas, and maybe we can talk a bit about that. But I think place-based work matters hugely because there are different local economies, there are different attitudes. I mean, just taking 2 large areas quite near to each other, we always found if we compared young people in Manchester and Liverpool, that young people in Manchester were much more outward facing. If they were coming to apply to universities, they might pick choices all over the country, whereas those in Liverpool would almost always have 3 of their 5 choices Liverpool universities, and even if they were accepted to places further afield, they were almost certainly going to be going to a Liverpool university without strong encouragement. And that is the same sort of young person, picked on the same criteria of disadvantage. So it really does matter what your local economy is, what your local attitudes are. Now, finally, I would just say that there is a long-running debate, which is also going on with myself and some of my parliamentary colleagues, but always went on when I was chief exec of the Social Mobility Foundation, which is whether we should be encouraging social mobility on the understanding that people may leave their home area, or whether we should in contrast to that, be encouraging community and encouraging people to stay in their home area. And I don't think there's a right answer to that. The view I took was that for many people in certain areas of the country, they might have to move away in order to be able to pursue what it is that they want to. And if they did so, they would be better able to help the area that they'd grown up in. But I know that there are different views, and that really what we're encouraging is a brain drain, and people should stay in their local area and support it there. So I'm sure we'll get into some of those issues in the discussion.
Well, I think that's a really good segue, because Tim, one of the key characteristics of successful place-based working identified by the Rank Foundation is looking at lessons learned, what works well, what doesn't work well. So when we're looking at this this issue of, what Charlie said about talent exported or talent rooted, which was in the last panel, or this sort of civic army idea where we have a lot of young people from lots of places in the UK coming into a place, or perhaps even what you do with placing young leaders to work in specific communities. I mean, what works well, what doesn't work well, and could you talk us through what the Rank Foundation has learned in this area?
I think empowerment of local leaders has been key. We found some really inspirational people doing unsung work in very disadvantaged areas, and I think empowering them, connecting them with others like that, I think that is the secret. We have a conference, a really very inspiring conference once a year, which brings a lot of these people together, and the dynamic in that is superb. So I think it is empowering people and connecting them with others. The quality of our local associates has been key. So I think those are things that we've learned. I mean, we started place-based funding. We tried it out in Burnley, in Corby. We looked at it in Swindon. And in the end, we found that the dynamism of local collaborators, the ability to empower people, that's been the key for us, really.
And what about the question of resources that David speaks of? Do you find that there are sufficient resources in areas to empower those leaders, I guess, to increase the change that they're able to generate within their communities?
Yes, we found that it's trying to, I think the notion of being there for 6 years is very important, because it gives you the opportunity to create momentum and sustainability. And we're seeing that now in Hull with its own local leadership program. Our associate there is still very active for us. So I think at Dundee, we've had already spin-offs from big initiatives like food banks. We now have our associate there runs a charity, Dundee Bairns, which delivers hundreds of meals to disadvantaged people on a daily basis. So I think, yes, it's very important to do it over a period of time and to be aware of the need to create sustainability.
David, could we look a little bit, could you tell us about the educational experiences of young people in your constituency, and to what extent they differ from experiences of the students at the schools in London?
Yeah, sure.
Well,
in one sense, the constituency is lucky because it's close to London. So some things are more possible than they are in other parts of the country. And the main town in my constituency is Didcot, which is a 40-minute train journey to Paddington, which is not to say that lots of people are going all the time for experiences, because they're not, but it enables me, I think, to be able to do things with employers that I knew to help young people in the area. But one of the big things about my constituency is it's very rural. And I often feel that rural communities are forgotten here. We've talked quite a bit, not today, but I mean in recent years, about coastal towns, and that's absolutely correct. but actually we tend to forget rural communities because most people don't have experience of rural communities. And if you are living really in the middle of nowhere, often you need to get the school bus that picks you up in the morning and in the afternoon. So there aren't even after school clubs, never mind the wide array of work experience and other opportunities that you might get in London. And particularly if you grow up on a farm, you know, one of the challenges in farming at the moment, our average farmer is 60 years old. Their children don't want to do it because it's very tough work. And so you are left with a group of young people who don't often have universities near them, who don't have employers worrying about them because they want higher population areas. And so are left with sort of much more limited horizons than people who live in big cities. So that's one big challenge for my constituency.
So do you find that in terms of sort of expanding those horizons, what types of interventions work?
Well, it partly comes down to the attitude of the school. And I think one of my frustrations in actually 16 years working with schools was the huge variety in how well they valued experiences outside the school. So whereas your typical private school would want to be getting as many external engagements as possible going and sending their pupils out as much as possible, in the state sector, you find a much greater variety than that. You find some who absolutely see it as core to their purpose, so they're engaging charities like IntoUniversity, the Social Mobility Foundation, and lots of others to provide work experience and mentoring and careers talks and support with thinking about further education and higher education. But there are too many schools that are focus much more on headline exam results. Now, I understand why that's the case, but actually we were always trying to encourage them, and something I continue to do at the moment, because you can see a contrast in the schools in my constituency, try to encourage them about what life do we want the young people from this school to have after they've left school. Part of that starts with government. One of my other frustrations has been that although the government now publishes destinations data, I don't think it makes enough use of it. We still always talk about 5A Star to C, Progress A, English Baccalaureate, things like this, rather than what happens to young people once they've left this institution, because that to me is the key measure of how well schools are doing.
That's quite interesting. I do want to pull back a little bit to this idea of schools and what schools are doing, and maybe to pull Tim back in here, where you're looking at this sort of relationship with schools and working with young people and sort of identifying, you know, leaders in local communities who are young. Can you just speak a little bit more about that and your experience?
Yes, I work with around 45 heads across the UK, and I think it's absolutely right that there's a huge variation in how open heads are to broadening the experience of their pupils. An awful lot of stuff comes across their desk. I think this is what the 8 of us are looking at, actually getting a local associate for a large area who could then present the complete offer to a head. And I think that might be an attractive way of getting all those different interventions into schools. Heads are very busy people, and I think they need help to open things up. But coming back to David's very interesting point about whether you're educating young people out of their area, one of the most inspirational schools I go to is Catholic Girls Grammar School on the Falls Road in Belfast. And they're among the most empowered young women I've encountered in schools anywhere. But the head, who's herself an old girl at the school, she feels her role is to educate. She said, we have no former pupils who have their children in this school, hardly any. We educate our girls up and out. And it's 30%, it's an unusual grammar school, 30% of the students are free school meals. So yeah, I think the head's interest in aspiration and how they define aspiration is a key part of it as well.
I think that kind of again brings us to that sort of overarching question, which we do struggle with, you know, is social mobility, is it about moving people away from disadvantaged, you know, areas to pursue opportunities, which you say is what they do here. And then in turn, you know, how does it then come around to benefit these places and these communities as well? So could you just say something about that through the work that the Rake Foundation does?
Sorry, whether we encourage people to get back to their own communities. Definitely, yes. And I think they do. I think one of our award holders who's just leaving school in Dundee has decided to go to Dundee University and will be heavily involved, I think, in our efforts in Dundee. So I think it's, yeah, I think there's a mixture. I think there's huge loyalty to the home area in parts of the country. The Cornish award holders I've dealt with have always told me that they plan in due course to return to Cornwall. So yeah, again, a big variation.
So maybe a little bit of a, maybe controversial, maybe not controversial, because we are focusing on the question of place. But do either of you, and maybe we'll go to David on this one. Do you think it matters more where a young person came from, or should we be looking perhaps at where they are going?
It's common for a politician, to my annoyance, to say we don't care where people come from, we care where they're going. And lots of leading businesses do that as well. But actually, to ignore where people have come from, I think ignores a lot of their experience, what makes them them, and is an excuse often for not really caring about how diverse an institution is. You know, you say we don't care where people come from, we just want the best people. And typically the organizations that say that are very homogenous. So actually, I think it does matter where people come from. I don't think we have a broad enough range of experiences in all sorts of institutions, from companies to government departments. And I do think that we have to, you know, one of the interesting things always about the Equality Act, when people look at that and the protected characteristics, is that class is not one of those. So often when people diversify, they get more women, more ethnic minorities into their institution, but from private schools and professional families. Now that is important diversity, but it's not the only diversity. Actually, the young people we were helping, 2/3 BAME, 2/3 female, but from low income backgrounds, I think their experience and what they can bring to things really matters. So so I'm afraid I'm of that. It does matter where you've come from school.
Yes, I'd agree. I think I'd be interested actually, Pasha, in your experience of Harvard, whether coming from South Carolina, do you feel comfortable throughout at Harvard? And if so, what made you feel comfortable?
Well, it's funny that's also a question from someone who's attending the conference today. Not that I'm supposed to become a panelist, but my view of my education in moving from South Carolina to Harvard is that was the greatest sort of educational experience of my life in terms of vocabulary, culture. You know, we talk about class. I don't think I had an appreciation of class prior to going there. And it was a stretching transition. I was a child, my father was in the military, so we moved a lot. So I was always used to sort of moving and recreating myself wherever we went. But most of the time I was in the South, so either Arkansas or South Carolina. And so there is a way of being in the South and a different way of being in the North. So I think a lot about this idea of having to move. So for me, it was very much crossing a threshold, so to speak. And I was almost a different person there than I was in South Carolina. And I haven't gone back to live or work or anything like that for a variety of reasons. But in someone who you know, that has now these aspirations to do lots of things, sometimes I don't see those opportunities, you know, where I grew up. So I'm push the panelists a lot on that to find out, you know, this idea of place, and when someone leaves a place and you're talking about resources and opportunity, you know, ensuring that you're sort of expanding those resources and those opportunities in those places is quite an interesting concept to me, so that there is something exciting to come back to.
I think sometimes we talk slightly at cross purposes. So there's a difference between the world as it is and the world as we would like to see it. Now, the world as we would like to see it is where every area in the country has got a thriving local economy with lots of good opportunities for people, whether they want to work or study close to home. The world as we would like to see it is that employers didn't focus all their recruitment on the narrow range of Russell Group universities, if they didn't recruit so many from Harvard in the US or from Oxbridge over here. But that's not the world as it is. Now, we can try and we should try and work to change that. But when you've got young people every year who've got to make decisions about what's going to be best for them, giving them advice which is based on the world as you might like to see it rather than the world as it actually is, I think is problematic, because it's not very honest to those young people about what's really going to make the difference to their life chances.
Well, maybe we've got a question from someone who's attending the conference today. So maybe we'll come back to people who are in communities, and whether or not the social mobility agenda has ignored those people who don't want to move up in society, don't want to go anywhere else. They love their local communities and they just want to stay there. So maybe Tim, you could speak about that a bit.
Yes, I think that we have to value that and accept that for some people that is what they want. And I think, again, that touches on what David has just said, that if we tell people that opportunities only exist elsewhere, and that if we narrow the range of opportunities in our own minds for them, I think that that's a narrow definition of aspiration for some people to do something very substantial in their own community without leaving the area is enormously commendable. And again, it's broadening our minds when we're suggesting possibilities to young people, I think.
We've got another question here where someone is interested in the panelists' views on the importance of engagement with primary schools rather than just secondary schools, and how important this is in systems change. Now, who wants to take that one?
Well, I can simply say that I think that's enormously important. All that was said earlier by Emma and that sort of thing is crucial. My scheme is a secondary school scheme, as are almost all of the other ones in our informal group of 8. But that's not to deny the critical importance of primary school interventions.
Have you seen any really interesting one? Because I know with, I guess, the School Leadership Awards, and I guess also David with what you were doing at the Social Mobility Foundation, where you're sort of looking for these local young leaders at the secondary school level. At the primary school level, what types of interventions have either of you seen there that really have been transformative, or that maybe some of the young leaders that you've identified through your other leadership schemes have been through or participated in?
Well, I mean, look, the organisation that I always thought was best with children from age 7 upwards was actually IntoUniversity, as it happens. But there was a very successful programme from the Royal Academy of Engineering trying to get young people at a very young age in primary schools to consider engineering. It was very intensive and very costly, and I don't believe it's running anymore. I mean, I think it's hugely important, but I'm reminded of Geoffrey Canada's experience in a Harlem Children's Zone, and he talks about how do you create escape velocity. So people sometimes hope if they do early years or they do primary education, that might propel people through the rest of their lives. There's not actually a lot of evidence that is the case. So I think it is important to do primary education, but I think for the most disadvantaged, you actually need support right the way through their life cycle. And sometimes we fall into thinking, well, if we just get 0 to 5 right, the rest will take care of itself. And actually, I don't think that's true.
Tim, do you want to add anything?
No, I would, as I say, I'm anxious about being thought of as an expert in anything, and certainly not an expert in primary schools.
I think I'll go to another question here. So the question is, as a charity offering cultural experiences and widening participation opportunities to young people in local areas of disadvantage, we are facing significant challenges now in terms of how to deliver these activities in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis and a potentially significant decrease in funding. Does David feel it may be important for the government to provide financial intervention for charities who serve young people with what may be considered to be non-essential services?
Well, if you knew how many requests I get every day for the government to provide funding to things, I think I'm running into trillions now. I mean, look, I think it's really important. I know that the simplistic answer people will give you is deliver it online. I think if you can't do anything else, then to deliver online is important. But I think I don't actually feel that online learning is a substitute for face-to-face. And I do think that sometimes young people who are have fewer advantages are sometimes fobbed off with being told that they can go online, whereas actually middle-class children from affluent families will be having a full range of experiences face-to-face. So look, I think what I don't know which charity it is, but I think providing cultural experiences is hugely important because that is often a gap for young people. Unfortunately, I'm not in a position to sign any government checks, but your position is noted.
The difference between the current world and the world we hope to see, perhaps, David. I've got a question for both of you. Either of you can speak first. When looking at these place-based approaches, do you think we should start with a local problem and look for a solution? Or do we start with sort of a local resource or initiative? So for instance, I'm thinking about the Civic University agreements that Richard was speaking about in the last panel. But do we start with a local initiative, a local university, a local resource, and look to support that?
I think I would say we identify an area where there are significant gaps and identify potential local collaborators who can make a difference and with whom we can work to remedy things. And that's certainly what Rank has done. There's a huge amount of reconnaissance which the foundation does before embarking on a full place-based initiative, and that's why we ended up in Hull, Dundee and Plymouth, but not in the end in 2 or 3 other cities that we looked at.
And out of those 3 cities, was any, I don't know, we've got a question from someone about work being done in Tyne and Wear, Newcastle, Sunderland and Gateshead. Did the Rank Foundation ever look at any of those areas for place-based initiatives? Just out of curiosity.
We didn't. I think we need, our chief executive refers to it as kicking the tires in particular places. And so it's our work. There are 4 executives in the foundation, and we travel all over the country all the time, for me visiting schools, for my colleagues visiting small charities, local community groups. And so we get a feeling for what's out there. And I think once we see that there is something with which we can work in a particular area, and as I say, the size of the city has always been important. That's what's guided us. But I'm sure if there's someone coming in from Sunderland and Tyne and Wear who'd like to contact the Rank Foundation, we'd be very happy to explore that further.
Great. So you all know how to get in touch with Mr. Young, if you do want
Yeah, I also don't sign the checks like David, so I'll happily pass the incoming on to my colleagues.
David, I want to come to you maybe with the final question, unless we have any more from our attendees. But you previously were running a national charity, and now you're a local MP. So has this shift in scale affected your views on place and place-based work, or have they remained consistent over time?
That's a very good question. I think it has shifted it, partly going back to what I was talking about earlier about rural communities, because I think I was as guilty of as anyone of starting with major cities, then thinking about coastal areas and small towns, and actually not doing enough to think about rural areas. And I was taken on a trip actually before I became an MP to some schools in rural Norfolk, which partly brought it home to me, and how everyone in that school wanted to be a teacher because it was the only people that they interacted with. Now, being a teacher is a great job, and we need lots of teachers. They're crucial to the country, but I was struck by the fact that everybody wanted to do that because it was the only career they ever saw apart from what they saw at home in their rural area. So I do think that the importance of finding a way to support young people in rural areas is something that has shifted in my understanding since I became an MP for one.
Right, thank you. We've got a last question that's come in here, which is, what does the panel think about post-qualification admissions in the face of COVID? So that's slightly off the overall theme of this this session, but maybe you do, if you have any thoughts, please do share. I don't know if you have any, David.
Yeah, I mean, I broadly support post-qualification admissions. I mean, I don't think it would be a total win for the groups I'm most concerned about, which are those that don't get into higher education in the numbers they should, or don't get into certain universities in the numbers they should. I think it would help some of them because they'd be able to demonstrate their grades. I was always struck by some of my friends that, you know, they'd get bad predicted grades just because they didn't get on with a teacher. And, you know, I've got friends who were predicted an E because of that and actually got an A. And it was all about their relationship with the particular teachers who set those predictions. And as we know, an incredibly high proportion of teacher predictions are wrong, anywhere from 2/3 to 90% plus, depending on which study you look at. So I think it probably would help quite a number of young people. There would be something that offset that, which is that people who've been predicted certain grades really impress their tutors, and then those universities want to keep them anyway, even when they slip their grades, they would probably miss out from a post-qualification system. But in broad terms, I think I support it.
Right. Thank you. Tim, I don't know if you have anything to add on that.
No, I would agree with David. It's broadly a good plan. It would need to be very carefully coordinated with starting dates of universities and the whole nature of university admission guidance in schools, I think.
Well, thank you very much, David and Tim, for joining this panel today. I think it's been a really interesting discussion, probably only scratching the surface of a lot of questions. But I do want to say thank you for your time and for participating.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Time to come with us today, and thanks also to Solomon, Hugh and Pasha for chairing the 3 different sections of the conference, and thank you to you for all attending.